Can you tell us a bit about Dante and why you think he's still significant for us today, and his ambivalence towards Islam, perhaps?
The best word I would use for it is amazing. It's supposed to create amazement in the reader. Yeah. And this is the first data that is very significant, because at the time of Dante, people were not used to that. Catholic writings were something more moral, something more explicit in what they were meaning to teach to the people. So Dante comes up, he writes, of course, poetry, he writes treatises on politics, normal stuff, and then he comes up with the comedy, which is really amazing. But it's amazing on many levels. One level is the fact of its origin. Like, where did he get this idea? Is this like the most incredible dream or vision one can have? And there has been a debate, because Dante was strongly influenced by Islam in his learning. For example, Ibn Rushd was a figure that for him was so important that he could not put him in hell. In fact, you find him in the purgatory. And we find many more allegories that have to say that Dante was at least fascinated and at least had respect for Islam. The nux of the problem is, of course, his Inferno, where we have this big issue as Muslims. But why was Dante forced in our understanding, perhaps as Muslim, to do what he did? Perhaps he had to affirm the fact that, okay, I have this sympathy for Muslims. I took the idea from Muslims. I wrote a treatise on monarchy, which really, really sounds like Al-Farabi. I put Ibn Rushd in the purgatory. Now I have to make people understand I'm really not so happy with Muslims. Otherwise, I would go into trouble. And if we're thinking about a time in which the church had strong control and could make or break a literary work, I think that perhaps his meaning in doing what he did are political and nothing more.
Fortunately, the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, is placed by Dante in hell. What I found interesting, if I can put it like that, about this is the reason he placed Muhammad upon him peace in hell is not because he was a Muslim. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It's because he was a Christian heretic.
And I think it is accurate also of general Middle Ages understanding of Islam, especially in the Italian peninsula. We can still talk about Italy at the time, but the idea that Muslims were a branch of Christians that took the teachings of the Gospels and then went another way was very widespread. And then for a while, in the periods of the Crusades and so on, there were ideas on the one hand that Muslims were pagans, worshipping the moon or some other ideas. But the majority of people believed actually that Muslims took the inheritance of actually Ishmael, the Old Testament, and then some of the teachings of Jesus, alayhum assalam, and took it forward in a direction, of course, that the church didn't approve of.
By the way, when it's called a comedy, there are no laughs in it. It's not funny. This is. Could you explain a bit about the word comedy? Because it's very misleading. We see the word comedy today, we think it's a joke. It's meant to be funny.
Yeah. So basically, we're talking about a time where literary genres were less than nowadays. So basically, when we were talking about work of imagination outside of poetry, what we could have was either a tragedy if it ended bad, or a comedy if it ended good.
Perhaps we can move on to other Italian thinkers talking about Islam. The only one I've heard of is Umberto Eco.
Islam is talked about in the Italian cultural world, especially in the high culture. So let's say philosophy of history in particular. But it is talked about in a way which is remarkably different than the way it is treated, for example, in the UK. That's another place I have experience of, or Germany. If we talk about Umberto Eco, he's very interested in the great figures of Islam, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, especially the ones that are relevant to the Western culture, that brought something to the West. And this is, of course, a way in which we could say, well, you're just looking at Islam as if it was instrumental to the West and not on its own right. But that's another story. What is interesting to me as a Muslim who lives now in Italy in 2024 is the fact that these thinkers have an idea of Islam as something really old and really finished, concluded. For example, in the books of Umberto Eco, we see sometimes the treatment of Islam as, the medieval splendor, or we talked about their great works of translation, as if they are different people, and there's not something that we're dealing with every day. And Umberto Eco, by the way, was a strong supporter of the theory that Dante took from the Islamic world, and that the Islamic world has given a lot to Italian culture, even before the thing called Italy actually was united.
Ambiguous relationship with Mussolini.
Actually, the relationship between, if I can expand a little bit on fascism and Islam, I think it's a very interesting topic, because Mussolini himself, he tried to portray himself as the starter of a new dialogue with Islam, because he said that before him, the church always had the negative view of Islam. But now Italy was not anymore the church. It was a new thing. And this new state under fascist rule could have good relationship potentially with Islam. So he did his best.
Was it a sense of wanting to recreate the Roman Empire, the glory,
through the understanding of many historians, Mussolini wasn't really meaning to expand or recreate Roman glory. That, of course, was the rhetoric. Just he came a little bit late to the colonial game and just took what was left over. However, at the same time, he sent several academics to start studying Islam. And that is one of the ways Orientalism in Italy started.
Right.
Because before, we just had Christian missionaries writing about Islam, and sometimes they did it in a way which was not 100% accurate, let's say. But then with fascism, we start having some people that were not so biased by religion, observing Muslims and describing them. But of course, they were biased by colonialism. So